I'll never forget the look of pure satisfaction on Richard's face when he handed me that termination letter, 30 minutes before my retirement celebration was supposed to begin. "Sorry, Tom. Budget cuts, you understand. We had to make some tough decisions." He said it like he was doing me a favor, standing there in his $1,000 suit while I held a pink slip in one hand and my 30-year service pin in the other. The conference room was already decorated with balloons and a cake that read, "Happy Retirement, Tom," sitting untouched on the table. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just an employee they could discard. I was the silent partner who owned 43% of the company. And after today, I was about to become their worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Thomas Hartwell, and for 30 years, I was more than just the head of operations at Meridian Industries. I was the backbone that kept the company running while others took the credit. I started as a junior engineer fresh out of state college, full of dreams and hungry for success. The company was small then, just 15 employees in a cramped office building, struggling to land contracts in the competitive world of industrial automation. I met Jonathan Meridian, the founder, on my first day. He was everything I wasn't. Charismatic, connected, born into money. But what he lacked was practical knowledge, the ability to turn ideas into reality. That's where I came in. While others played politics and networked at fancy lunches, I spent my days on factory floors, learning every bolt, every wire, every process that made our systems work. The first 5 years were brutal. We barely made payroll some months. I remember nights when Jonathan would be at charity galas while I stayed until 3 a.m, troubleshooting a system that could make or break a major contract. My wife, Sarah, would pack me dinner and kiss me goodbye, never complaining about the long hours or missed family dinners. She believed in the dream as much as I did. Everything changed in year 7. We landed a massive contract with Apex Manufacturing. It was a breakthrough that would define the company's future, worth over $50 million. Jonathan called a company meeting the next morning, beaming with pride as he announced the news. But what stung was how he told the story, as if he'd single-handedly secured the deal through his charm and connections. I stayed quiet, like I always did. The truth was, I'd spent 3 months living at the Apex facility, redesigning their entire production line, fixing problems their previous contractors couldn't solve. I'd worked 20-hour days, slept on the factory floor, and personally convinced the plant manager that we could deliver what others couldn't. But Jonathan got the handshake, the photo in the industry magazine, the reputation as a visionary leader. That night, Jonathan invited me to his office. "Tom," he said, pouring himself a scotch from his crystal decanter, "I want to offer you something. You've been instrumental in our success. How about some ownership in the company?" He slid a document across his mahogany desk. 2% equity. It's unheard of for someone in your position. I looked at the papers, then back at him. "Jonathan, I appreciate the gesture, but I think my contributions warrant more. Perhaps 5% would be more appropriate." His smile faltered for a moment before returning, thinner this time. 2% is generous, Tom. Take it or leave it." I left it. I walked out of his office that night feeling smaller than I had in years. But something in me had shifted. I realized that no matter how hard I worked, how many problems I solved, how many impossible deadlines I met, I would always be just an employee in Jonathan's eyes. The talented engineer who could fix things but could never be an owner. 3. Months later, I got a call from Robert Pemberton, a venture capitalist who'd been watching our company. "I'm interested in investing in Meridian," he said. "But I need someone who really understands the business, someone with operational expertise to help make this deal work. I've heard your name mentioned more than Jonathan's when industry people talk about what makes that company successful." We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. Robert was direct, no nonsense. Jonathan's a good face for the company, but you're the engine. I want to invest, but I need assurance that someone competent will be involved in major decisions. Here's what I'm proposing. I'll put in $15 million for 25% of the company, but I want you to have a significant ownership stake too. Not the token amount Jonathan offered you. He outlined the deal. Through a complex investment structure, I would indirectly own a substantial portion of the company. The investment would flow through a holding company that Robert controlled, but which would allocate ownership percentages to key personnel. It was perfectly legal, all documented, and filed correctly, but structured in a way that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers. Why would you do this? I asked. Robert smiled. Because I've done my homework. I've talked to your clients, your suppliers, your former colleagues. When they think of technical excellence at Meridian, they think of you. I'm not just investing in the company. I'm investing in the people who actually make it work. The deal went through. Jonathan was ecstatic about the capital infusion, the validation from a respected investor. He threw a lavish party to celebrate, gave interviews to industry publications about his vision for the company's future. What he didn't pay attention to were the legal documents, the ownership structures, the fine print that outlined exactly how the company was now controlled. I didn't change. I kept the same small office, drove the same reliable pickup truck, ate lunch with the engineers and technicians rather than the executives. But I started documenting everything. Every major decision, every technical innovation, every contract negotiation. I built relationships with key clients, ensured they knew who was really responsible for the quality and reliability they valued. Sarah noticed the change in me, though I hadn't told her about the ownership structure yet. You seem different, she said one evening as we sat on our back porch. More confident, maybe? Like you're carrying yourself differently. I smiled and kissed her forehead. Maybe I'm just finally seeing my worth. Over the next 15 years, Meridian grew exponentially. We went from that small operation to a company with over 2,000 employees, multiple locations, and contracts with major corporations across 3 continents. And through it all, I remained the steady, reliable Tom Hartwell. The guy who knew where every wire went, who could solve any technical crisis, who could be counted on to work late, come in early, and fix whatever needed fixing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jonathan, meanwhile, grew more and more distant from the actual operations. He spent his time at conferences, giving keynote speeches about innovation and leadership. He hired expensive consultants, pursued trendy management philosophies, and surrounded himself with vice presidents who were better at PowerPoint than problem-solving. The disconnect became more obvious with each passing year. Jonathan would announce grand initiatives in company meetings, strategic pivots toward emerging markets, partnerships with technology companies he'd met at golf clubs. I'd sit in those meetings, taking notes, watching as my actual work, the systems I'd designed, the processes I'd optimized, the relationships I'd built with clients, was repackaged and presented as someone else's vision. One particular incident stands out. We were pursuing a contract with a German automotive manufacturer. The technical specifications were demanding, requiring a level of precision and customization that stretched even our capabilities. Jonathan insisted on flying to Munich for the final presentation, taking along the head of sales and 3 junior executives. The presentation was a disaster. They couldn't answer basic technical questions, proposed solutions that were fundamentally flawed, and essentially lost the deal in the first hour. I got a panicked call that evening. Could I fly over immediately? Could I salvage the situation? I spent the next 2 weeks in Germany, starting from scratch. I toured their facility, talked to their engineers, understood their specific challenges. I redesigned our entire proposal, incorporated their feedback, and addressed every concern they raised. On my last day, the plant manager took me aside. "Mr. Hartwell," he said in accented English, "when we heard Meridian was bidding, we were excited. Your reputation precedes you. But when your CEO came here, we thought perhaps we had made a mistake. You have restored our confidence." We got the contract. It was worth $42 million and led to additional opportunities throughout Europe. But at the company celebration, Jonathan told it differently. He spoke about his critical initial meeting that opened the door for our technical team to complete the details. He never mentioned that his initial meeting had nearly killed the deal. I started keeping a file. Not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for protection. Every email that showed the real source of an innovation. Every contract where my personal relationships had been the deciding factor. Every instance where my technical expertise had saved a project that management had nearly ruined. The culture at Meridian began shifting in ways that made me uncomfortable. Jonathan hired his nephew, Richard, straight out of business school and fast-tracked him through various departments. Richard had the polish that Jonathan admired: expensive, education, smooth presentation skills, a natural ease with company politics. But he lacked understanding of our actual business, our core competencies, our client relationships. Richard was named Vice President of Operations when he was barely 30. I trained him, showed him the systems I'd spent decades perfecting, introduced him to key clients. What I didn't realize was that he saw me not as a mentor, but as an obstacle. I represented the old way of doing things, the unglamorous reality behind the company's success. The changes started small. Processes I'd established for quality control were streamlined. Client meetings I'd always attended were suddenly too detailed for senior leadership. My recommendations were increasingly questioned, not based on their merit, but because they came from someone without an MBA, someone who'd worked his way up from the shop floor. Sarah noticed I was staying later at the office, bringing more work home. "What's happening there?" she asked. "You've never seemed this stressed about work before." I tried to explain the shifting dynamics, the feeling that 30 years of contributions were being dismissed, but it was hard to articulate. How do you describe the death of respect by 1,000 small cuts? The breaking point came during a board meeting I wasn't supposed to hear about. Jonathan had hired a strategic consulting firm to conduct an organizational efficiency review. The consultants had spent 3 months at our company, interviewing everyone, analyzing operations, and preparing their recommendations. I was working, late in my office when I heard voices in the conference room. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized Jonathan's voice, along with Richard's and several board members. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer, careful not to be seen. "The consultant's findings are clear," one of the board members was saying. "Your operations head is brilliant technically, but he's become a bottleneck. He's too hands-on, too resistant to modern management practices. Clients and suppliers have personal relationships with him rather than with the company, which creates risk." "He's earned respect the old-fashioned way," Jonathan replied, though his tone suggested he was already convinced. "But you're right. Tom's approaching 60. Maybe it's time for fresh leadership in operations." Richard's voice was next, smooth and confident. "I've built excellent relationships with our key accounts. Many of them have expressed interest in working with younger management, people who understand digital transformation and agile methodologies. Tom's approach worked for the company Jonathan built, but we're in a different era now." "The succession plan writes itself," another board member added. "Richard steps into full operational control. We can offer Tom a consulting role, perhaps emeritus status. Preserve his dignity while moving the company forward." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. 30 years of building this company, of solving impossible problems, of sacrificing my evenings and weekends, and they saw me as dead weight. Someone whose only value now was the graceful manner of his departure. I stayed in my office until nearly midnight, staring at the technical drawings on my walls, the patents with my name on them, the thank you letters from satisfied clients. Everything I'd built felt suddenly fragile, like it could be erased by a boardroom decision made by people who barely understood what we actually did. That night, I called Robert Pemberton. Despite the late hour, he answered immediately. "Tom? Is everything all right?" "Robert, I need to understand something about the ownership structure we set up all those years ago, the documents Robert and I had signed, my actual legal position in this company." His voice sharpened. "What's happening?" I told him about the meeting I'd overheard, the proposed succession planning. There was a long silence. Then Robert spoke, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. "Tom, I think it's time you fully understood what we established 15 years ago. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? Bring those documents I gave you. All of them." That night, I barely slept. I thought about my father, who'd worked 35 years at the steel mill and been laid off 6 months before his pension vested. I thought about all the promises companies make to loyal employees, and how little those promises mean when spreadsheets start talking. But I also thought about those documents in my home safe, the papers I'd filed away and barely thought about, over the years. Tomorrow, I would finally understand what protection they offered, if any. The next morning felt different. I dressed carefully, not like someone preparing to fight, but like someone preparing to stand firm. As I drove to Robert's office, I realized that regardless of what those documents contained, something fundamental had changed. I was done apologizing for my worth. I was done accepting that brilliance without pedigree was somehow less valuable. I was about to learn whether 15 years of quiet legal planning would be enough to protect 30 years of irreplaceable contribution. But either way, Tom Hartwell was no longer going to be anyone's expendable employee. The manila envelope on Robert's desk seemed ordinary enough. But as he spread its contents across the mahogany surface, I realized my entire future, and the company's, was about to be redefined. Those documents I'd signed 15 years ago weren't just investment paperwork. They were something far more powerful, and I was about to understand exactly what kind of war I was equipped to fight. The papers spread across Robert's mahogany. Desk told a story I hadn't fully grasped until that moment. What I had understood as an investment arrangement was actually an elaborately crafted ownership structure that placed 43% of Meridian Industries directly in my name. Not through some complex holding company. That had been the cover story. The truth was far simpler and more powerful. "Tom," Robert said, watching my face as I processed the documents, "when I did my due diligence 15 years ago, I discovered something interesting. You weren't just the engine of that company. You were its true architect. Every major innovation, every significant client relationship, every system that actually worked bore your fingerprints. Jonathan was a front man for your genius. He pulled out a thick folder I hadn't seen before. I spent 6 months investigating before I made that investment. I interviewed former employees, suppliers, even competitors. The consensus was unanimous. Without Tom Hartwell, Meridian Industries would be just another failed startup from the 90s. My hands trembled slightly as I held the stock certificates. They weren't photocopies or drafts. They were original documents, properly notarized and filed with the state. But why didn't you tell me the full truth? Why the story about the holding company? Robert smiled grimly. Because you needed time to grow into the power. If I'd told you 15 years ago that you owned nearly half the company, you might have confronted Jonathan immediately. You weren't ready for that fight. You still saw yourself as an employee, not an owner. You needed to build your confidence, document your contributions, develop the leadership skills that would serve you when the time came. He was right. 15 years ago, I would have stumbled, apologized, maybe even given the shares back to keep the peace. But 30 years of watching my ideas presented as someone else's vision had hardened me. 30 years of being the person they called when everything was falling apart, then ignored when the credit was distributed, had taught me exactly what I was worth. "There's more," Robert continued, handing me another set of documents. "The way we structured this, you also have unilateral veto power over any major personnel decisions. The board can vote all they want, but they can't fire a single executive, can't restructure operations, can't even change building leases without your explicit approval." I stared at the clause buried in the legal language. It was there in black. And white. A poison pill I hadn't known I held. How is this possible? How has this stayed hidden for 15 years? "Because people see what they expect to see," Robert replied. Jonathan wanted to believe he'd found a brilliant investor. Who believed in his vision? The board wanted to believe they were working with sophisticated investment professionals. None of them bothered to trace the ultimate ownership structure. They saw my signature on the big checks and assumed I was just another venture capitalist, with too much money and too little sense. Over the next 2 hours, Robert walked me through every detail. The investment hadn't been his money, it had been mine, accumulated through years of bonuses and profit sharing that I'd unknowingly been directing into this acquisition. Robert had been my agent, my front man, creating a structure so complex that even the lawyers who'd reviewed it over the years hadn't fully grasped its implications. "Your wife knew," he said, watching my surprise. "Sarah helped me gather the documentation I needed, gave me insights into your character, confirmed that you were the kind of person who could handle this responsibility when the time came. She's been hoping for 15 years that you'd finally step into your power." The thought of Sarah keeping this secret, believing in me enough to help orchestrate this elaborate protection, filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. She'd watched me struggle with being undervalued, seen the frustration in my eyes after every meeting where my contributions were minimized, and she'd never once hinted that I had the legal power to change everything. "Why now?" I asked. "Why reveal this today?" Robert's expression darkened. "Because Richard and Jonathan are planning something that would destroy not just your position, but the company itself. Your forced retirement is just the first step. They're planning to sell the automation division, the core business you built, to one of our Chinese competitors. The money looks good on paper, but it would gut everything that makes Meridian valuable." He handed me a leaked email chain that made my blood run cold. Richard had been in negotiations for months, secretly meeting with representatives from Huaxia Industrial Solutions. They weren't just buying our division, they were buying our intellectual property, our client lists, our operational secrets. Everything I'd spent 30 years developing was being packaged as a commodity to be sold, to the highest bidder. "They can't do this without my approval," I said, finally understanding the full scope of the protection Robert had created. "No, they can't. But they don't know that yet. They think firing you eliminates the last obstacle to their grand plan. They believe once you're gone, they can restructure the company however they want, sell whatever they want, hire whoever they want." I felt something crystallizing inside me, a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about 20,000 jobs, about American technological independence, about ensuring that every late night I'd spent troubleshooting systems, and every weekend I'd sacrificed had meaning beyond just Jonathan's profit margins. "What's the next step?" I asked. Robert smiled, and I saw something almost predatory in his expression. "First, we let them fire you. We let them think they've won. Then, after they've committed to their plan, after they've started celebrating, and making promises to their Chinese buyers, we reveal the truth. But not in some dramatic boardroom confrontation. That's movie theater nonsense. We do it systematically, professionally, devastatingly." Over the next 3 hours, we outlined a strategy that would have impressed Sun Tzu. Every move was calculated, every contingency planned. We would use their arrogance against them, their ignorance of their own company's legal structure as a weapon. I drove home that evening feeling like I was seeing everything with new eyes. The suburban neighborhood where Sarah and I had lived for 27 years looked different. The modest two-story house we'd bought when I was still just a senior. Engineer felt like a fortress now, not a symbol of my limitations, but a testament to my ability to build something lasting. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing dinner as if this were any other Tuesday. But when she turned to greet me, her eyes held knowledge she'd been carrying for 15 years. "He told you everything," she said. It wasn't a question. I pulled her close, holding her tighter than I had in months. 15 years you kept this secret. 15 years you watched me doubt myself while you knew I had this power. She pulled back to look at me. "Oh, honey, you had the power all along." The documents were just paper. Your knowledge, your relationships, your ability to solve impossible problems. That's what real power looks like. The legal ownership was just insurance, protection for when you were finally ready to claim what was already yours. That night, we talked until dawn. Sarah told me about the meetings with Robert, about the careful planning that had gone into creating this safety net. She'd known about every slight, every dismissal, every time I'd come home frustrated by decisions made by people who understood neither the technology nor the customers. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she admitted, "especially during those board meetings where they treated you like furniture. But Robert was right. You needed to develop the confidence to wield this kind of power responsibly. You needed to understand your own worth before you could demand that others recognize it." The next morning, I went to work differently than I had in years. I wasn't walking into a place where I had to prove my value. I was walking into my own company, temporarily managed by people who'd forgotten who was really in charge. I spent the day observing with new eyes. I watched Richard conduct a meeting with our German clients, butchering technical specifications I'd spent months perfecting. I saw Jonathan approve a budget that would undermine 3 critical innovation projects. I witnessed middle managers who'd been promoted based on politics, rather than competence making decisions that would cost us clients within 6 months. But I didn't intervene. Not yet. I documented everything, not for protection this time, but for the prosecution that would come later. The termination meeting was scheduled for 4:30 p.m. in Jonathan's office. As I walked down the hallway at exactly 4:29, I passed the conference room where my retirement party was supposed to begin in an hour. The decorations were still up, the cake still waited, already paid for by a company that apparently couldn't afford to keep its most valuable employee. I knocked on Jonathan's door precisely on time. "Tom, come in. Please sit." His voice carried that tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news and want to sound compassionate about it. Richard was there too, sitting to Jonathan's left with a folder of documents. Neither of them could quite meet my eyes as Jonathan began his prepared speech about budget pressures, restructuring needs, and the exciting opportunities this transition would create for younger leadership. I let him finish. I didn't argue when he talked about my generous severance package or the consulting opportunities they might offer. I didn't point out that I'd identified and solved the very problems they were now using to justify my termination. I just sat quietly, watching 2 men who had no idea they were about to learn a lesson in power dynamics that would reshape their understanding of everything. When Jonathan handed me the termination papers, I read them carefully. Then I set them down and spoke for the first time since entering the office. "Before I sign these," I said calmly, "I need you both to understand something about this company's ownership structure. There seem to be some misconceptions about who can actually hire and fire executives here." The slight smirks on their faces told me everything. They thought this was desperation, a last-ditch attempt to negotiate better terms. Richard actually rolled his eyes slightly. "Tom," Jonathan said with exaggerated patience, "I know this is emotional, but the decision's been made. The board is unanimous. Your services are no longer needed. I smiled then, the kind of smile that comes from knowing a secret so big it changes everything. Jonathan, I need you to call Robert Pemberton, right now. Tell him that Tom Hartwell is requesting an emergency ownership verification meeting. Tell him that I'm ready to exercise my shareholder rights. Jonathan's condescending expression flickered. Tom, Robert's just an investor. He doesn't get involved in daily operations. Call him, I repeated, my voice carrying a quiet authority I hadn't used in this office before. Tell him exactly what I said, and suggest he bring his legal team. Something in my tone must have penetrated because Jonathan picked up his phone. The conversation was brief, and I watched his face change as Robert spoke. When he hung up, his hand was shaking slightly. He'll be here in an hour, Jonathan said slowly. Tom, what's this about? I stood up, straightening my tie. It's about making sure everyone understands exactly who owns this company. 1 hour, Jonathan. I suggest you use that time to review your corporate governance documents very carefully. As I walked out of the office, leaving them scrambling, through filing cabinets, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The fear was gone. The self-doubt had evaporated. For the first time in 30 years, I was about to show everyone exactly who Tom Hartwell really was. The retirement party decorations suddenly seemed prophetic. Tonight would mark the end of something, but not my career. It would be the end of me accepting less than I deserved, the end of watching my contributions be minimized, the end of a company taking its most valuable asset for granted. In 1 hour, everything would change. The only question was whether Jonathan and Richard were smart enough to understand how completely they'd miscalculated what they thought was a simple termination. The hour that followed was the longest of Jonathan and Richard's professional lives. I can only imagine the frantic phone calls, the desperate searching through files, the slowly dawning horror as they realized how little they understood about their own company's legal structure. But I wasn't in that room watching their panic unfold. Instead, I was in my office, cleaning out 30 years of memories and preparing for what would come next. Sarah arrived at 5:45, earlier than expected. She found me boxing up the patents and technical drawings that lined my walls. Robert called me, she said simply. He thought you might need moral support. I paused, holding a framed photograph from our first major contract completion in 1994. I've been terrified for so long, I admitted. Terrified of losing this job, of being seen as ungrateful or disloyal. But sitting here today, I realize I've been afraid of the wrong thing. What should you have been afraid of? She asked. Of staying small, of accepting less than I deserved for so long that I forgot what I was actually worth. I set the photograph down carefully. 30 years I've been building other people's dreams while treating my own like hobbies. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that held decades of understanding. Robert was right to wait. You needed to discover your own power, not just inherit it legally. The knock on my door came at 6 p.m. sharp. Robert entered first, followed by 2 lawyers I didn't recognize, then Jonathan and Richard. Behind them came 3 board members who looked like they'd been dragged from their dinners. Jonathan's face was pale, Richard's was flushed with anger. Tom, Robert said formally, I understand you've requested an ownership verification meeting. These are my attorneys, Dr. Elizabeth Chen and Mr. David Rodriguez. They've brought the complete legal documentation regarding Meridian Industries' ownership structure. Dr. Chen opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick binder. She spoke with the precise tone of someone delivering information that would reshape reality. Mr. Hartwell, we're here to confirm your legal position as the majority beneficial owner of Meridian Industries. Through the investment structure established in 2008, you currently hold 43.2% ownership, which, combined with your veto powers on major decisions, gives you effective control of the company. The silence in the room was deafening. Jonathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Richard looked like he might be sick. "That's impossible," one of the board members sputtered. "Robert Pemberton owns the largest stake. We've seen the investment documents." Mr. Rodriguez smiled thinly. "Mr. Pemberton was acting as agent for Mr. Hartwell." Every dollar invested came from Mr. Hartwell's accumulated bonuses and profit sharing, redirected through our firm for the purpose of creating this ownership structure. The legal documentation is unassailable. I watched their faces as the truth settled in. 30 years of treating me as a highly skilled employee, replaceable despite my knowledge, and they'd been managing my company for me. "But the board voted," Richard said weakly. "We have authority to restructure operations." Dr. Chen flipped to a specific page. "Mr. Hartwell's rights supersede board decisions in several key areas. According to Article 12, Section 4 of the revised corporate charter, filed in 2008, any decision involving the sale of company divisions, termination of senior operations personnel, or substantial changes to core business activities requires his explicit written approval." The room felt charged with electricity as the implications struck home. I stood up slowly, gathering a confidence that had been building for 15 years. "Jonathan," I said quietly, "I believe you had some documents for me to sign." He stared at the termination papers as if they might burst into flames. "Tom, we didn't know. We need to discuss this." "No," I said firmly. "We need to discuss a lot of things. But first, let's address the elephant in the room. Richard, would you care to explain your negotiations with Huaxia Industrial Solutions?" The blood drained from Richard's face. Jonathan whipped around to stare at him. "What negotiations?" Jonathan demanded. Robert reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. "These are copies of emails, meeting notes, and preliminary agreements. It appears Mr. Richard Meridian has been conducting secret negotiations to sell your automation division to a Chinese conglomerate for $240 million. The silence that followed was broken by Jonathan's explosive anger. "You what? Richard, what the hell have you been doing?" "I was trying to save the company," Richard burst out. "We're losing market share. Our technologies are outdated. The Chinese offer would give us the capital to pivot into new markets." I laughed, a sound that surprised everyone, including myself. "Outdated technologies?" "Richard, this month alone, 3 Fortune 500 companies are implementing systems I designed last year. The obsolete automation protocols you want to sell have cut production costs by 23% average across our client base." Dr. Chen nodded. "Mr. Hartwell, given your ownership position, this proposed sale would require your approval, which you clearly haven't given." "And won't give," I added. "But I am curious about one thing. Richard, what did you plan to tell our existing clients, the ones who specifically contracted with Meridian because of our automation expertise?" Richard's jaw clenched. "They'd adapt. Business is about evolution, not clinging to past successes." "Is that what you think I've been doing? Clinging to the past?" I moved to my computer, bringing up a presentation I'd been working on. "Let me show you something, everyone." The screen filled with technical diagrams, market analyses, and implementation timelines. "This is the Meridian 3.0 initiative I've been developing. Next-generation automation that combines IoT integration with predictive maintenance algorithms. I've spent 2 years refining this, have provisional patents on 7 breakthrough innovations, and have 3 major clients ready to pilot the program." The room was utterly silent as I walked through the presentation. Each slide showed not just technical innovation, but clear business applications, revenue projections, and strategic advantages that would position Meridian at the forefront of industrial automation for the next decade. "The Chinese company," I continued, "was specifically interested in acquiring our automation division because they knew about these developments. Richard, in your negotiations, Did they mention the Meridian 3? Zero preliminary specs? His silence was answer enough. Jonathan's face had gone from pale to red. You gave them our proprietary information? I shared what was necessary for due diligence, Richard said defensively. What was necessary, I repeated slowly, was asking the person who developed these systems whether selling them made strategic sense. You decided I was too old, too set in my ways to understand modern business. But you didn't understand the business at all. I turned to the board members. Gentlemen, ladies, let me explain exactly what Richard was about to sell. The automation division generates 67% of our revenue. The client contracts tied to our proprietary systems represent 85% of our, say, multi-year commitments. Selling to Huaxia wouldn't just gut our core business. It would hand our biggest competitive advantages to a company that's been trying to replicate our systems for a decade. One of the board members, Margaret Washburn, spoke for the first time. Tom, why didn't you bring this initiative to us sooner? I looked at her directly. Because every time I've presented technical innovations over the past 5 years, I've been told they're too complex for our business model, or that we should focus on our current offerings rather than chase after shiny new objects. Sue, my last 3 proposals for R&D funding were rejected. The weight of that truth settled over the room. These people had been so focused on quarterly profits and industry buzzwords that they'd ignored the gold mine sitting right in front of them. Mr. Hartwell, Dr. Chen said formally, do you wish to exercise your rights regarding the proposed sale to Huaxia Industrial? I veto the sale completely, I stated. Furthermore, I want a complete audit of all information shared with them and immediate termination of any ongoing negotiations. Robert smiled slightly. That can be arranged. Jonathan found his voice again. Tom, we need to talk about the company's direction. Clearly there have been miscommunications. Miscommunications? I repeated. Jonathan, you tried to fire me with 30 minutes notice after 30 years of service. That's not a miscommunication. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am and what I've built here. I moved back to my computer, pulling up another presentation, this one focused on organizational structure. Since we're having a complete ownership disclosure meeting, let's discuss how this company should actually operate moving forward. The slides outlined a comprehensive restructuring plan that I'd been developing secretly for months. It wasn't just about technical innovation. It was about creating a company culture that valued expertise over politics, results over relationships. First, I began, we're establishing a technical innovation board with veto power over any decisions that affect core operations. No more strategic pivots developed in boardrooms by people who haven't set foot on a factory floor in a decade. Richard's face was crimson. You can't restructure the entire company around outdated hierarchies. I'm not, I replied calmly. I'm creating systems that ensure the people who understand the technical realities have a voice in decisions that affect them. Would you perform surgery without consulting surgeons? Build bridges without consulting engineers? Margaret Washburn nodded slowly. Tom's right. We've been making decisions without properly consulting our technical experts. Second, I continued, we're implementing profit sharing for all employees based on innovation contributions, not just sales or management positions. The engineer who designs a system that saves a client millions should benefit from that directly. I could see the board members' wheels turning. This wasn't just about protecting my position, it was about creating a sustainable competitive advantage. Third, we're establishing clear protocols for any future divestiture discussions. No major asset sales without a 90-day evaluation period and approval from both the Innovation Board and myself. Jonathan cleared his throat. Tom, this is quite comprehensive, but we need to consider practical implementation, budget, implications. I've already run the numbers, I said, bringing up financial projections. These changes will increase profitability by 18% within 2 years, while reducing employee turnover by an estimated 40%. The cost of implementation is roughly half what we would have spent on management consultants this year alone. The room fell silent again as everyone processed the implications. I wasn't just flexing my newfound legal power. I was demonstrating that I'd been thinking strategically about the company's future while they'd been planning my exit. Dr. Chen spoke up. Mr. Hartwell, would you like to formalize any of these proposals as board resolutions? I looked around the room, seeing 30 years of history in these faces. Some looked angry, others confused, but most looked thoughtful. They were beginning to understand that everything they thought they knew about Tom Hartwell had been wrong. Not today, I said finally. Today has been about establishing the legal reality. Tomorrow we start building something better. I moved back to my desk and picked up the termination documents Jonathan had presented earlier. In one smooth motion, I tore them in half. Gentlemen, ladies, I'll see you all at the Monday morning board meeting. Richard, I strongly suggest you use the weekend to review our actual client contracts and the competitive intelligence reports from the past 2 years. You might learn something about the business you tried to sell. As the room emptied, Robert lingered behind. How do you feel? He asked. I looked out my office window at the parking lot where I'd parked the same reliable pickup truck for 20 years. Tomorrow I might park it in the CEO's spot, or I might redesign the entire parking system to reflect actual contributions to the company rather than arbitrary hierarchies. I feel like I'm finally awake, I said. For 30 years, I've been playing by rules that were designed to limit me. Now I get to help write the new rules. Sarah appeared in the doorway. Ready to go home? Or do you have a new company to redesign first? I smiled, putting my arm around her. The company's been waiting for 30 years. It can wait until Monday. As we walked toward the elevator, I realized that being fired had been the best thing that could have happened to me. Not because it felt good, but because it had forced me to stop accepting limitations that were never real in the first place. The retirement party decorations were still up in the conference room as we passed. Tomorrow, I'd organize a different kind of celebration, one that honored the contributions of every person who made Meridian Industries actually work, not just the ones who looked good in annual reports. The elevator doors closed behind us, but I wasn't descending. After 30 years of accepting that good enough was all I deserved, I was finally heading up. The Monday morning board meeting was set for 9 a.m., but I arrived at 6:30. The building felt different in these early hours, mine in ways it never had before. I used the CEO elevator for the first time, not out of entitlement, but as a declaration. The empire I'd built from the ground up was finally being acknowledged, and I wasn't going to apologize for claiming what I'd earned. I spent those quiet hours before the meeting reviewing every detail of our upcoming transformation. This wasn't just about settling scores or proving points anymore. This was about building something revolutionary, something that honored both innovation and the people who made innovation possible. Sarah had insisted on coming with me, not to the meeting itself, but to witness this new chapter. She sat in my office reviewing the quarterly reports while I made final adjustments to my presentation. You know what I realized this weekend? She asked, looking up from the financials. What's that? You've already been running this company for years. You just haven't been taking credit for it. She was right. Every major decision, every crisis, every breakthrough, they'd all flowed through me on some level. I'd been the shadow CEO, the person with actual answers while others held the titles. Robert arrived at 8:45 with his legal team, followed shortly by the board members who filed in with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Jonathan looked like he hadn't slept. Richard like he'd been rehearsing arguments all weekend. Margaret Washburn spoke first as soon as everyone was seated. Tom, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this weekend has been educational. Several of us spent considerable time reviewing the actual structure of this company, the source of our innovations, the reality of our client relationships. She paused. We owe you an apology. Richard snorted. We owe him an explanation of how this legal manipulation happened, not an apology. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 30 years of preparation in every movement. Let me be clear about something, Richard. There was no manipulation. I'm the person who built the systems that generate your salary. I'm the one who designs the solutions that keep our clients loyal. I'm the engineer who solves the problems that no one else can solve. The legal ownership wasn't a trick. It was a reflection of reality. I moved to the presentation screen. But we're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to build the future. The first slide showed current company performance metrics, the ones that looked good in annual reports. The second slide showed the metrics that measured what actually mattered: innovation rate, client satisfaction scores, employee retention in critical positions, and the technical advancement pipeline. We've been optimizing for the wrong things, I continued. We've been focused on quarterly profits and investor relations while our core competitive advantages began stagnating. I clicked to the next slide, showing a comparison between Meridian and our 3 biggest competitors. 2 years ago, we were leading in every category that mattered. Today, we're barely holding our ground. Want to know why? The silence in the room was answer enough. Because we've promoted people based on their ability to present, rather than their ability to perform. We've made strategic decisions in conference rooms instead of consultation with the people who understand the technical realities. We've treated innovation like a department rather than a company-wide philosophy. Jonathan cleared his throat. Tom, if you have specific concerns with leadership decisions— I have specific concerns with everything, I cut him off. But more importantly, I have specific solutions. The next series of slides outlined what I called the Meridian Renaissance Plan. It wasn't just structural changes. It was a complete reimagining of how a technology company should operate in the modern era. First, we're implementing what I call expertise-weighted decision-making. Before any major operational decision, the board must consult with our technical advisory panel, composed of our senior engineers and lead researchers. No more strategic pivots decided by people who haven't touched the technology they're voting to change. Richard leaned forward aggressively. That's completely impractical. You can't run a business by committee of technicians who don't understand market forces. You mean like the market forces that led you to try selling our most valuable assets to our biggest competitor? I asked quietly. Tell me, Richard, which of our current contracts depends on technologies you fully understand? His silence spoke volumes. Second, I continued, we're restructuring the profit-sharing model. Currently, executive bonuses are tied primarily to stock performance and overall revenue. Under the new system, 40% of all profit sharing at every E level will be tied to innovation metrics, patents filed, problems solved, client satisfaction improvements, process optimizations. One of the board members, Harrison Polk, frowned. That could create perverse incentives. As opposed to the current system that incentivizes quarterly thinking over sustainable growth? I moved to the next slide. This breakdown shows how the new system would have distributed profits over the past 5 years. The people who actually drive our success would have been rewarded appropriately. The numbers were striking. Under the proposed system, our top engineers and innovative staff would have earned significantly more, while executive compensation would have been tied to actual long-term company performance rather than market timing and financial manipulation. Third, we're creating multiple career advancement tracks. Not everyone dreams of becoming a manager. Some of our best minds want to solve increasingly complex technical problems. We're establishing a senior technical fellow track that offers compensation and respect equivalent to C-suite positions. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's actually brilliant. We've lost talent because technically gifted people felt forced into management roles to advance. Exactly. A world-class engineer who becomes a mediocre manager helps nobody. I clicked through several more slides detailing implementation timelines, budget allocations, and expected outcomes. Each proposal was backed by detailed analysis, projected costs, and potential returns. The total cost of these changes in the first year would be approximately $12 million, I concluded. The projected increase in productivity, retention, and innovation would recover that investment within 18 months and generate an additional $45 million in value over 3 years. The room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "Tom, this is comprehensive. But implementing changes of this magnitude would require the approval of the ownership." "Majority," I finished, which, as we established Friday, would be me. The power dynamic in the room shifted palpably. This wasn't a proposal I was advocating for. It was a plan I was implementing. Dr. Chen spoke up from her seat. "Mr. Hartwell, are you presenting these changes as board motions for discussion or as executive decisions?" "I'm presenting them as the new operating principles for this company, effective immediately. The board can discuss implementation details, but these aren't suggestions. They're directives from the majority owner." Richard stood up abruptly. "This is insane. You can't just overturn 30 years of corporate structure because you're having some kind of midlife crisis." I looked at him steadily. "Richard, in 30 years at this company, how many technical innovations have you personally developed? How many client problems have you solved? How many patents bear your name?" His mouth opened and closed wordlessly. "Because in that same 30 years, I've personally developed 47 proprietary systems, solved over 300 critical technical challenges, and hold 23 patents that generate approximately $30 million annually in licensing fees alone." I paused. "So tell me again how my understanding of this company is somehow inadequate." Margaret Washburn raised her hand. "Tom, I think what Richard is trying to say is that legal ownership aside, there are practical concerns about implementation speed. Organizational changes of this magnitude typically require time we don't have," I interrupted. "While we've been playing corporate politics, our competitors have been gaining ground. The Huaxia negotiations weren't happening in isolation. 3. Other companies have been circling us, seeing our stagnation as an opportunity." I clicked to a new slide showing intelligence gathered over the weekend. "My team spent Saturday analyzing our competitive position. We have approximately 18 months before someone else develops equivalent technology to our core systems. If we maintain current operational practices, we'll be an acquisition target within 2 years." The soberness of this reality settled over the room. These weren't academic changes or power plays. They were survival strategies. Harrison Polk cleared his throat. "Tom, assuming we move forward with these changes, what assurance do we have that your approach will succeed?" I smiled for the first time that morning. "You have 30 years of evidence. Every major success this company has had. Every technical breakthrough. Every satisfied client. That's your evidence. The question isn't whether my approach will work. The question is why we've been operating differently." Robert, who had been quiet throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "Perhaps it's time to address the elephant in the room. Tom, are you planning to assume the CEO role?" I had anticipated this question and spent considerable time over the weekend thinking about my answer. "I'm not interested in traditional corporate titles," I said finally. "What I'm interested in is ensuring this company operates according to its actual strengths. Jonathan, you're excellent at investor relations, at presenting our successes to the market. Richard, despite our current disagreements, you have valuable skills in strategic partnerships when properly guided." I paused, looking around the room. "I'm proposing we restructure leadership around competencies rather than egos. I'll take the newly created position of Chief Innovation Officer, with operational authority over all technical divisions. Jonathan remains CEO for external affairs and investor relations. Richard, if he's willing to learn, can head business development under the new framework. The compromise was elegant and practical. It acknowledged everyone's strengths while ensuring that technical decisions were made by people who understood the technology. "What about oversight?" Margaret asked. "How do we ensure accountability in this new structure?" "Through results," I replied simply. "Every quarter, we measure innovation output, client satisfaction, employee retention in critical roles, and long-term strategic progress. The executive team's compensation is directly tied to these metrics, not stock price or revenue alone." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Hartwell, would you like these structural changes formalized legally?" "Yes. I want a special charter amendment filed reflecting the new operational structure. I want the technical advisory panel written into the governance documents. I want the profit-sharing formula legally protected so it can't be changed in future board meetings." Over the next 2 hours, we worked through implementation details. Richard fought each change, but his objections became increasingly futile as the logic of each decision became clear. Jonathan, to his credit, began engaging constructively, asking practical questions about timing and resource allocation. The ICR meeting finally concluded at 1:30 p.m. As people filtered out, Margaret lingered behind. "Tom," she said quietly, "I owe you a personal apology. I've been on this board for 8 years, and I never bothered to truly understand where our success came from. I just looked at the numbers and assumed competent management." "The numbers can lie," I replied. "They can show profit without showing sustainability, growth without showing foundation." She nodded. "What you've proposed today, it's going to change everything. That's the idea." After everyone left, Robert and I sat in my office reviewing the legal documents his team would need to prepare. Sarah had moved to the conference room, giving us space to work. "How do you feel?" Robert asked, echoing his question from Friday. "Like I'm finally building instead of just maintaining," I said. "For 30 years, I've been fixing problems, created by people who didn't understand the business well enough to avoid creating them in the first place." My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "We need to talk privately, tonight. 7 p.m., Hoffman's Bar." I showed the message to Robert, who raised an eyebrow. "Curious, what do you think he wants?" "Probably to try negotiating some kind of separate peace," I replied, "or to offer information about the Huaxia deal in exchange for keeping his position." "Are you going?" I considered for a moment. "Yes, but not alone." That evening, Robert and I arrived at Hoffman's Bar promptly at 7 p.m. Richard was already there, nursing a whiskey and looking like a man who'd spent the day reassessing his entire career. "Tom," he said as we approached his table, "thanks for coming." "What do you want, Richard?" He gestured for us to sit. "I want to understand what just happened to my life." For the next hour, Richard talked about pressure from his father to prove himself as more than just the nephew who got a free ride, about consultants who'd convinced him that radical change was necessary to survive, about the Huaxia deal being presented as a way to save the company rather than gut it. "They told me you were the problem," he admitted, staring into his drink. "Too attached to old ways of doing things, too protective of outdated systems. They said fresh thinking required clearing out the old guard." "Who is they?" Robert asked. Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Mackenzie, Strategic Consulting. They've been advising us for 6 months, and—" He hesitated. "There are others. People who would benefit from Meridian struggling." He explained a web of consultants, potential investors, and competitors who had been subtly influencing the company's direction. The Huaxia deal wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger effort to destabilize and acquire American technology companies. My God, I said, realizing the scope of what we'd barely avoided. You weren't just selling a division. You were being manipulated into dismantling the entire company. Richard nodded miserably. And I thought I was being a visionary leader. By the end of the conversation, I understood that Richard hadn't been the primary architect of my termination. He'd been a useful idiot, manipulated by forces that understood exactly how to appeal to his ego and insecurities. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked at this man who'd tried to fire me not 3 days ago, who'd nearly sold everything I'd built to our competitors, who represented everything I'd grown to resent about modern corporate culture. And I made a decision that surprised even me. "Richard," I said slowly, "you're going to help me build something better. But first, you're going to learn what this company actually does." Over the following weeks, Richard became my shadow, not as punishment, but as education. I took him to client sites, showed him the technical realities behind our solutions, introduced him to the engineers and technicians who made everything work. Something remarkable happened. Away from the corporate environment, away from the pressure, to appear knowledgeable about things he didn't understand, Richard revealed a genuine curiosity about how things actually worked. He wasn't stupid. He'd just been operating in a system that rewarded confidence over competence. By the end of the month, Richard had developed a real appreciation for the complexity of our business. He also uncovered the full extent of Mackenzie's strategic's influence, providing evidence that helped us extricate ourselves from several damaging consultant contracts. The transformation of Meridian Industries proceeded faster than anyone had imagined possible. When people understood that changes were coming from the person who actually built the company, resistance dissolved quickly. Engineers who had been frustrated for years suddenly found their ideas being heard. Manufacturing staff saw their efficiency improvements implemented rather than ignored. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where my retirement party decorations had hung, watching our team present Meridian 3.0 to a group of Fortune 500 executives. The contract signed that day totaled over $300 million. Sarah was there, beaming with pride as I demonstrated technologies that had only existed in my notes a year earlier. Jonathan handled the business presentations flawlessly, finally able to talk about innovations he genuinely understood. Richard, now heading our strategic partnerships division, had developed into someone I actually respected. Someone who understood that true leadership required mastering the substance, not just the style. After everyone left, I found myself alone with Robert in the conference room. "Any regrets?" he asked. I looked out the window at the parking lot where my old pickup truck sat next to Jonathan's Mercedes and Richard's BMW. Tomorrow, we were breaking ground on a new research campus. Next month, we were hiring 60 new engineers and technicians. "Just one," I said finally. "What's that?" "I regret waiting 30 years to believe I deserved this." Robert smiled. "Well, you've got decades ahead to make up for lost time." As we walked toward the elevator, I thought about all the people who'd told me to be grateful for what I had, to not rock the boat, to appreciate steady employment. They meant well, but they'd been wrong. Being grateful for less than you deserve isn't humility. It's a betrayal of your own potential. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped inside. As we rose toward the executive floors, my floors now, I realized that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. It's building something so remarkable that everyone who underestimated you has to acknowledge their error. It's showing the world that the person they tried to discard was actually the foundation everything else was built upon. It's proving that sometimes the greatest power comes not from climbing someone else's ladder, but from building your own staircase to the sky. And I was just getting started. 6 months after the ownership revelation, Meridian Industries was a completely different company. The changes weren't just cosmetic, they were fundamental, reaching into every corner of our operations. But the real transformation wasn't in our organizational charts or profit margins. It was in the people who walked through our doors every morning with a renewed sense of purpose. I was in the new innovation lab, watching Maria Santos, one of our senior engineers, explain a breakthrough in predictive maintenance algorithms to a group of interns. Maria had been with us for 12 years, brilliant but overlooked under the old system because she preferred solving problems to playing politics. Under our new structure, she'd been promoted to Senior Technical Fellow, a position that didn't exist 7 months ago. The key insight, Maria was saying, pointing to complex equations on the digital whiteboard, was realizing that machine degradation follows patterns we can predict if we collect the right data points. Mr. Hartwell suggested looking at harmonic frequencies that everyone else ignored. 6 months later, we can predict equipment failures with 94% accuracy. I smiled, remembering the conversation where this innovation had emerged. Not in a formal meeting, but during a plant floor walkthrough where Maria had mentioned an interesting anomaly she'd noticed. In the old Meridian, her observation would have been filed away in a maintenance report that nobody read. In the new Meridian, it became the foundation for a technology that was already saving our clients millions. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Elizabeth Chen. Board meeting at 2 p.m., special agenda, good news. Board meetings had become dramatically different affairs. Instead of PowerPoint presentations about market positioning and competitive landscapes, we now dedicated time to understanding actual innovations and their implications. Board members had undergone what I called technical immersion sessions, real education about what we did and why it mattered. I walked to the boardroom, passing the new employee recognition wall. It wasn't filled with photos of executives shaking hands at charity events. Instead, it showcased patents, solved engineering challenges, client success stories, and process improvements. Real achievements by real people. Margaret Washburn was already seated when I arrived, reading through a thick document with obvious excitement. Jonathan entered right behind me, looking more energetic than I'd seen him in years. Richard came in last, carrying what appeared to be champagne glasses. Interesting props, I commented. Robert appeared in the doorway with Dr. Chen and several other people I didn't recognize. Tom, he said with a grin I hadn't seen before, meet representatives from the Smithsonian Institution. The woman leading the group stepped forward. Mr. Hartwell, I'm Dr. Rebecca Okafor from the National Museum of American History. We're here about the Carter Meridian Innovation Award. I frowned. I'm not familiar with that award. Dr. Okafor smiled. That's because it doesn't exist yet. The Smithsonian is creating a new annual recognition for American engineering innovations that preserve manufacturing jobs while advancing technology. Your Meridian 3.0 system will be the inaugural recipient. The room fell silent. This wasn't just a business achievement. It was historical recognition of the kind of engineering innovation that defined American industry. There's more, Dr. Okafor continued. The President's Council on Advanced Manufacturing wants to use Meridian as a case study for their new Made in America 2.0 initiative. They're particularly interested in how you've increased productivity while expanding employment, not reducing it. Margaret leaned forward. What exactly does this mean for the company? It means, said one of Dr. Okafor's colleagues, that Meridian Industries will be featured in a permanent exhibition about modern American manufacturing excellence. More importantly, you'll be part of a national program promoting industrial innovation and engineering education. I felt a strange mix of pride and humility. We'd been so focused on saving our company, on proving our worth, that we hadn't realized we were also demonstrating something larger, a model for how American manufacturing could evolve without sacrificing its roots. Richard raised his champagne glasses. I thought the occasion called for something special. As we toasted this unexpected honor, Dr. Chen shared the legal implications. This recognition opens doors to federal research partnerships, educational grants, and international collaborations. The publicity alone will be worth millions in marketing. But what struck me most was something Dr. Okafor said as the formal meeting wound down. Mr. Hartwell, your story isn't just about business success. It's about proving that experience and innovation aren't opposites. They're partners. That's a message American industry desperately needs right now. Later that evening, I found myself in my office, now the Chief Innovation Officer's suite, with windows overlooking both the original facility and our new research campus. Sarah was there, having joined me for what was becoming a weekly tradition of reviewing the week's achievements over takeout Chinese food. "Remember when you thought you were too old to start over?" she asked, reading the Smithsonian letter again. "I never thought I was too old," I corrected. "I thought I was too small." She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I spent 30 years thinking that because I didn't have certain credentials, because I came from a state school instead of MIT, because I preferred overalls to suits, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps they threw me." I paused, looking at the letters and awards now covering my desk. I thought my role was to make other people successful. Sarah nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I know that the work itself was what mattered. The titles, the degrees, the fancy words, they're just packaging. What matters is whether you can solve problems that other people can't solve." My desk phone, "Yang." The display showed White House operator. Sarah's eyes widened as I answered. "Tom Hartwell." "Mr. Hartwell, please hold for the president." A moment later, a familiar voice came through the speaker. "Tom, good evening. I hope you don't mind the late call." "Not at all, Mr. President." "I wanted to personally congratulate you on the Smithsonian recognition. But more than that, I wanted to thank you. In an age where too many companies ship jobs overseas or replace workers with automation, you've proven there's a better way." I glanced at Sarah, whose expression was wavering between pride and disbelief. "Thank you, sir. Though I should point out that we didn't do this to be patriotic. We did it because it was the right way to run a business." The president laughed. "That's exactly why it matters. People can sense authenticity. When businesses thrive by leveraging American innovation and supporting American workers, that resonates. I'd like to invite you to visit Washington next month. We're announcing new initiatives to support advanced manufacturing, and your story could help inspire others." After the call ended, Sarah and I sat in stunned silence for a moment. "So," she finally said, "the President of the United States just called to congratulate my husband on his business model." "Apparently." "And you're taking it remarkably calmly for someone who 8 months ago thought he was about to be discarded like an old machine." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. "You know what the strangest part is? None of this feels like validation anymore. When Jonathan first handed me those termination papers, I felt like I needed to prove something. To him, to Richard, to the board. But sitting here now, I realize I don't need anyone's approval. We succeeded because we did the right thing, not because we were trying to be recognized for it." Sarah smiled. "So what happens next?" "International. Speaking tours, consulting with struggling companies, writing a book about organizational transformation." I considered this. We'd received dozens of invitations to speak at conferences, multiple offers from publishers, and requests to consult with companies facing similar challenges. But none of that interested me the way our ongoing work did. "What happens next?" I said slowly. "Is we get back to work. We have 17 major innovations in development, 3 new manufacturing processes to refine, and about 50 brilliant people who are just hitting their stride." But even as I said it, I knew the real answer was more complex. Success changed. Everything, even when you tried to stay grounded. The calls weren't just coming from the White House anymore. Competitors wanted to understand our methods. International corporations sought partnerships. Universities wanted to study our transformation. The irony wasn't lost on me. By refusing to be diminished, by fighting to preserve what I'd built, I'd inadvertently created something much larger than anyone had imagined. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Maria Santos peered around the door. "Sorry to disturb you. Mr. Hartwell, I know it's late, but I wanted to share something." She entered carrying a tablet and barely contained excitement. "You know the Johnson manufacturing project we've been working on? The impossible retrofit?" I nodded. Johnson manufacturing made agricultural equipment, and their assembly line was considered too old and complex to modernize efficiently. Every consultant they'd hired had recommended replacing everything, a $40 million investment they couldn't afford. "We did it," Maria beamed. "Not only did we solve the retrofitting challenge, but the new configuration will increase their production. Capacity by 35%. Total cost, $800,000. Sarah whistled softly. "That's remarkable." "But that's not the best part," Maria continued. "Mr. Johnson called an hour ago. Because we saved his company, he's hiring back 37 workers he laid off last year. American workers, in American factories, making American equipment." I felt something shift inside me, a deepening understanding of what we'd accomplished. This wasn't just about corporate success or personal vindication. We were proving that American manufacturing could evolve without abandoning its fundamental strengths. "Maria, that's excellent work. Make sure the entire team knows how proud I am of their innovation." After she left, I turned back to Sarah. "Remember what you asked about international speaking tours and consulting?" "Yes? I think I was wrong. There is something we need to do beyond just running our own company." She raised an eyebrow. "We need to teach others, not in some theoretical, consultant-heavy way, but practically. Show them how to value the experience they have, how to innovate from strength rather than starting from scratch." Over the following weeks, this idea evolved into what we called the Meridian Model Program. We opened our doors to other manufacturers, not as competitors, but as potential partners in revitalizing American industry. The first company to visit was Harrison Metal Works, a family-owned operation in Pennsylvania that had been hemorrhaging contracts to overseas competitors. Like Meridian, they had old equipment, experienced workers, and owners who understood their business but felt overwhelmed by talk of digital transformation and Industry 4.0. Bill Harrison reminded me of myself 10 years earlier, suspicious of consultants, protective of his workers, and frustrated by experts who talked about best practices without understanding the specific challenges of his industry. "These efficiency consultants," he complained during our first meeting, "they want to replace half my workforce with robots and ship the rest to Mexico. They talk about optimizing human capital like my employees or office supplies." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Bill, can I show you something?" I led him to our factory floor, but instead of a typical dog and pony show, I introduced him to Tony Martinez, one of our machine operators with 43 years of experience. "Tony," I said, "tell Bill about the modification you suggested for the stamping equipment last month." Tony explained how he'd noticed a vibration pattern that indicated premature wear in the die mechanism. His solution, adding a secondary dampening system, increased the die's life by 300% while improving product quality. "Cost of implementation?" I asked. $47 in parts, Tony grinned. "Plus 2 hours of my time." Bill stared. "That single change saves you how much annually?" "Approximately $180,000, I answered, not including the improved quality metrics. Over the next 2 days, Bill saw dozens of similar examples. Not revolutionary technologies or expensive overhauls, but incremental improvements suggested by experienced workers and implemented by engineers who understood that innovation could come from anyone. "This is what your consultants missed," I explained. "They saw your experienced workforce as an expense to minimize. We see ours as a source of competitive advantage." By the end of his visit, Bill was energized in a way I hadn't seen during his initial presentation. "Tom, this isn't just about saving companies. This is about saving communities. When manufacturers fail in small towns, everything else follows." He was right. Over the following months, as word spread about our open-door policy for struggling manufacturers, I began to see patterns. These companies weren't failing because they lacked resources or market position. They were failing because they'd been convinced that their greatest assets, experience, institutional knowledge, relationships with suppliers and customers, were actually liabilities in the modern economy. The Meridian Model Program evolved into something unprecedented. We created a network of manufacturers who shared innovations, supported each other's transformations, and proved that collaboration could coexist with competition. The personal letters started arriving in floods, workers from across the country writing to thank us for proving that experience still mattered, engineers who'd been told they were too old to adapt, expressing gratitude for demonstrations that innovation didn't require youth, owners of small manufacturers requesting visits, seeking hope that they could evolve without sacrificing their values. One letter particularly moved me. It came from Janet Morrison, a 54-year-old quality control manager from Ohio. "Mr. Hartwell, I've worked in manufacturing for 32 years. 5 years ago, our company brought in consultants who said my attention to detail was excessive and my methods were outdated. And they wanted to replace visual inspections with automated systems. I spent 2 years thinking I was obsolete, that everything I'd learned was worthless. Then we implemented your hybrid model, combining my experience with new sensor technology. Our defect rate dropped by 78%, and my insights saved the company $3 million. Thank you for proving that wisdom and innovation can work together." Reading letters like Janet's, I understood that our transformation at Meridian had started something bigger than any of us had imagined. We weren't just saving companies, we were validating the value of American industrial experience. The invitation from Congress came in late autumn. The House Subcommittee on Manufacturing wanted me to testify about revitalizing American manufacturing through innovation and experience integration. Standing at that witness table, looking up at elected representatives from across the country, I felt the weight of representing something larger than myself. This wasn't about Tom Hartwell or Meridian Industries anymore. This was about proving that America could compete globally without sacrificing what made American manufacturing special. "Chairman, members of the committee," I began. 9 months ago, I was fired on my retirement day by executives who believed experience was a liability rather than an asset. Today, I'm here to tell you that the greatest threat to American manufacturing isn't foreign competition or technological advancement. It's the belief that everything we've learned over decades is obsolete, that innovation requires starting from scratch. I shared data showing that companies implementing the Meridian model were seeing average productivity increases of 42% while expanding their workforces by an average of 23%. These weren't outliers. They were becoming the norm among manufacturers willing to value both experience and innovation. The choice, I concluded, isn't between high-tech and high-touch. It's not between automated efficiency and human flexibility. The future of American manufacturing lies in combining the best of both, leveraging technology to amplify human expertise, not replace it. After the hearing, Representative Maria Gonzalez from Texas approached me. "Mr. Hartwell, I represent a district with 17 small manufacturers. Is there any way to bring the Meridian Model Program to them?" 3 months later, we opened our second training center in San Antonio. Similar centers followed in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Each one demonstrated that the crisis facing American manufacturing wasn't about inevitable decline. It was about rediscovering the confidence to compete on our own terms. As I write this, exactly 1 year after those termination papers were placed in front of me, I'm sitting in my office preparing for tomorrow's announcement. We're launching the American Manufacturing Excellence Initiative, a collaboration between private companies, community colleges, and federal agencies to train the next generation of manufacturing professionals. But tonight, I'm thinking about something simpler. In a few hours, I'm driving home to Sarah, who will be waiting with dinner and probably the latest stack of letters from workers and owners we've helped. We'll talk about our grandchildren's science fair projects and whether the garden needs attention before frost sets in. Because that's what success really looks like, not the headlines or the awards or the congressional testimony. Success is being able to go home each night knowing that the work you did that day mattered, that the systems you built will outlast you, that the people you mentored will teach others what you taught them. Success is proving to yourself that you were never too old, too small, or too ordinary to change the world. It just took getting fired to remember that. Tomorrow, the cycle begins again. New challenges, new opportunities to prove that experience and innovation can create something better than either could achieve alone. But tonight, I'm content to be Tom Hartwell from Ohio, who solved problems for 30 years, got fired for being too good at it, and discovered that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be diminished. And who, in the process, accidentally, helped remind an entire nation that its greatest competitive advantage was never technology or capital. It was the people who understood both how things work and how to make them work better. The story continues tomorrow. But tonight, that's enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.